It is the autumn of 9 AD. Deep inside the Teutoburg Forest, in a land that Rome had not yet tamed, something is very wrong. 3 Roman legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, have just been destroyed. In 3 days, roughly 20,000 soldiers vanished in ambush and slaughter the Romans never fully processed or forgave. Arminius, the Germanic chieftain, lured them into a kill zone, and the forest swallowed them whole. But tonight, we are not with those dead legions. Tonight, we are a few hundred miles to the west, in a different Roman camp. A marching camp, thrown up from raw earth and wooden stakes before the sun went down. Outside the palisade walls, the dark Germanic wilderness presses in from every direction. You can hear things out there. Movement, branches snapping. Maybe it's deer, maybe it's not. And inside the camp, 8 men lie crammed into a leather tent the size of a small bathroom. The tent smells like wet dog, sweat, and stale bread. 2 men are out on the perimeter for their watch shift. The other 6 try to sleep on the ground with their wool cloaks as a mattress and blanket. No pillow, no cot, just the earth, darkness, and the sounds in the trees. This is how the soldiers of the Roman Empire slept on campaign. And here's the thing. This system, this brutal, exhausting, rigidly organized way of spending the night in hostile territory was one of the most important military innovations in human history. Not the gladius, not the pilum, not even the famous Roman roads. The way these men managed the night was a core reason why Rome conquered the known world. Most people think of Roman military power in terms of battles. Cannae, Grzama, Pharsalus, the clang of steel and the roar of thousands. But battles are actually a small fraction of what military life is. Most of soldiering is not fighting. Most of soldiering is marching, eating, building, waiting, and above all, sleeping. Managing human fatigue. Keeping men functional day after day after day in conditions that would break most of us in a week. Rome solved that problem in a way no other ancient civilization came close to matching. They solved it with an almost neurotic obsession with structure. With a nightly ritual so embedded in the identity of the Roman legionary that giving it up, centuries later, when discipline had eroded and the empire was rotting from the inside, was one of the clearest signs that something irreversible was happening. Tonight we're going inside that system. We're going inside the tent, inside the camp, inside the 4 watches of the Roman night. We're going to understand why falling asleep at the wrong moment could get you beaten to death by your own unit. We're going to understand what 8 men ate, smelled, heard, and felt in those hours before dawn. And we're going to understand why this quiet, mundane, relentless discipline was, in its way, just as powerful as any army Rome ever fielded. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the end of the march. Before we can understand how Roman soldiers slept, we need to understand what they did all day before sleep was even on the table. A Roman legionary on campaign marched. He marched a lot. The standard Roman march, what they called a iter justum, the regular pace, covered about 20 Roman miles per day, which works out to roughly 18 to 20 modern miles. On a forced march, iter magnum, that could push to 24 miles or more, every single day, wearing armor, carrying weapons, and carrying everything else too. That everything else is where it gets punishing. After the general Gaius Marius reformed the Roman army around 107 BC, every legionary became responsible for lugging his own equipment rather than relying on a massive baggage train. The soldiers became known as Muli Mariani, Marius's mules. And the name wasn't affectionate. Each man carried a loaded pack that historians estimate at somewhere between 66 and 90 pounds, depending on the campaign. That includes his armor, his weapons, his entrenching tools, wooden stakes for the camp palisade, his portion of food rations, and his personal kit. You are walking 18 miles a day with a fully loaded hiking pack that weighs as much as a full-grown German shepherd for months, through Gaul, through Germania, through the deserts of North Africa, through the mountains of Judea. Now you've arrived at your campsite. Are you done? Not even close. Here is the rule that governed Roman military life in the field, and it was iron. No Roman army halted for even a single night without constructing a fortified camp. Not one night. The historian Josephus, watching the Romans prepare for war in Judea, wrote with something close to awe that the Romans do not begin to fight until they have walled their camp about. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. No other army in the ancient world operated this way. The Greeks picked good ground and camped in the open, where the Germanic tribes threw their wagons in a circle. The Parthians simply scattered and regrouped. But the Romans? Every night, without exception, they built a fortress, and they built it fast. According to ancient sources, a standard marching camp for a full legion could be completed in 3 to 6 hours, under threat of enemy attack. They had trained for that scenario too. One portion of the army would stand in battle formation while the rest dug, and then they would swap. The camp was not optional. The camp was not a luxury. The camp was the point. That relentless engineering discipline, performed by exhausted men at the end of an already brutal day, is the first thing we need to understand about Roman sleep. Because before anyone in that legion could close their eyes, the camp had to exist, and making it exist was entirely their job. The Roman marching camp, the castra estiva, or summer camp, was not an improvised bivouac. It was a standardized military installation that followed a template so consistent, so rigidly defined, that a soldier transferred from a legion in Britain to a legion in Syria would recognize the layout instantly. Same streets, same gate positions, same spatial relationships between the headquarters tent and the troops' quarters, same everything. And that consistency was itself a weapon. Here's how it worked. When the column halted for the day, a group of specialists called metatores, or surveyors, would ride ahead. These were the men with the measuring rods, the decempedi, 10-foot staffs used to lay out precise dimensions, and a tool called a groma, which functioned as a Roman transit level for establishing right angles. The metatores would identify the site, orient it along the cardinal points of the compass, and begin planting colored pennants into the ground before the main body of troops even arrived. By the time the legions marched up, the camp was already marked out on the ground. Every unit knew exactly where its tent lines would go. They didn't have to think. They just had to execute. The standard camp was rectangular. The Romans called its shape a playing card, and archaeologists who dig up the remains still use that description. Around the perimeter, a fossa, a ditch dug 3 to 4 meters wide and roughly 3 meters deep. The earth from that ditch was thrown inward to create the agger, a rampart that added additional height. On top of the rampart, the palisade, is a row of sharpened stakes called sudes, or valley. And those stakes? The soldiers had carried them on their backs during the entire day's march. That weight was factored into the load calculation. The palisade stakes were as much a part of the marching kit as the gladius. The camp had 4 gates, one on each side, with a principal road, the Via Principalis, running between the 2 main lateral gates, and a second major road, the Via Praetoria, running from the headquarters toward the front gate. The whole internal space was divided into sections as deliberately as a city grid. But here's the detail that I think gets overlooked in most discussions of Roman military engineering. There was a 60-meter-wide clear strip, the intervallum, running all the way around the inside of the palisade, out between the wall and the first row of tents. 60 meters of nothing. Why? Multiple reasons. It served as a catch zone for any arrows or javelins that cleared the wall. It served as an assembly and muster area in case of a night attack. It served as a holding pen for cattle, prisoners, and plunder. And it meant that even if the perimeter was breached, the attacker would have to cross 60 meters of open, lit, guarded ground before reaching a single sleeping soldier. This was not paranoia. This was engineering applied to the problem of sleep. The Romans understood that you cannot rest if you don't feel safe, and they built safety from raw timber and dirt every single evening. The labor was divided with the same precision as the layout. While the engineering units marked the perimeter and directed the major earthworks, the individual centuries had their specific assignments. This cohort digs the eastern ditch. This cohort raises the rampart at the northern face. This cohort stands in battle formation covering the workers in case of attack. And if the enemy did attack while the camp was being built, the working parties dropped their tools, formed up, and fought, then went back to digging when the threat was repelled. The camp construction did not stop. It was built to continue even under fire. There is a famous anecdote from Livy about the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus in 168 BC, just before the Battle of Pydna. A young officer burst into camp to tell him that the enemy was in a perfect position to be attacked right now. They should abandon camp construction and strike immediately. The officers around Paulus practically begged him to give the order. But he refused. He climbed the tribunal and told them, "We do not attack until the camp is finished." The camp was finished. Then they attacked. Then they won. The discipline to do the unglamorous, necessary work first, even when the exciting opportunity was right there, was itself part of why Rome kept winning. When the camp was finished, ditch dug, rampart raised, palisade planted, gates built, watchtowers erected, the soldiers finally got to pitch their tents. They had built a small city. Now they could sleep in it. And as Polybius wrote, soldiers arriving at the finished camp moved to their assigned positions as if they had entered a well-known city and were marching to their accustomed quarters. Every detail is familiar, every detail planned. Now we get to the fundamental unit of Roman military life. Not the legion of 5,000 men, not the cohort of 480, not even the century of 80 soldiers. The fundamental unit of Roman life on campaign was the contubernium. 8 men who shared a tent, shared a mule, shared a cookpot, and for all practical purposes, shared a life. The word itself tells you everything. Contubernium comes from the Latin for tenting together. That's what these men were, people who shared a tent. Linguistically, socially, and militarily, the tent was the relationship. The men inside it were contubernales, tent mates, and that bond carried real weight in Roman military culture. Think about what it means to live in 9 square meters with 7 other men for months at a time. You wake up in the same cramped space. You eat together. You march together. When one man screws up, don't you all feel it? Because the Romans were perfectly willing to punish an entire contubernium for the failures of one of its members. Rewards worked the same way. You won together, or you suffered together. That's not an accident. That's social engineering. The Romans understood that men who have shared real hardship, real proximity, real mutual consequence will fight harder for each other than men who are merely colleagues. 10 of these 8-man groups made up a centuria, a century, which was commanded by a centurion. The centurion was the backbone of the Roman army, a professional, experienced, usually terrifying officer who was the immediate human authority in every soldier's daily life. He was not your friend. He was not meant to be. He had a staff of vine wood, the vitis, and he used it. But within the centuria, within those 10 tent groups, there was also a lower level of informal leadership, the decanus, the tent leader of each contubernium. The decanus held no formal rank in the sense of a commissioned officer. He was simply the most experienced man in the group, appointed from within the 8. His job was practical: organize the erection of the tent each night, make sure the tent was properly maintained, ensure his men kept things tidy, and represent the group in the morning's rotation for guard duty. He was the NCO of the tent, the sergeant of the sleeping arrangement. Each contubernium also had 2 attached servants, auxiliary support personnel who were responsible for the care of the group's pack mule. These servants were not fighting men in the traditional sense. They handled logistics, and they made sure the mule was loaded and ready to march. They fetched water during the day's movement. Some had specialized skills: a blacksmith, a carpenter, a man who knew how to keep leather from rotting. The mule they cared for was not just a beast of burden. It was the contubernium's entire mobile life support system. And here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about the contubernium. This arrangement is not just military efficiency. It is something deeper. It is an acknowledgement that men cannot sustain themselves through pure discipline. They need belonging. The Roman army, for all its brutality and hierarchy and iron rule, understood that the smallest unit of fighting power was not the individual soldier. It was the group of men who woke up next to each other every morning. Let's talk about the tent itself. It's because this is where the rubber meets the road, where all that marching and all that camp building came down to a single, very specific, very cramped reality. The standard Roman legionary tent was called the tentorium, though soldiers apparently also called it the papilio, the butterfly, supposedly because of the way it looked when it was being unfolded and set up. The wings are spreading out. It's a charming image. The reality of living inside one was less charming. The dimensions are well documented, and they're worth sitting with. The standard contubernium tent was approximately 10 Roman feet square, which works out to roughly 3 meters by 3 meters, or about 9.8 feet by 9.8 feet. The roof height at the peak was about 1.5 meters, which is just under 5 feet. So you could not stand fully upright inside. But the tent was built for lying down and not much else. Now put 8 men in there. 8 men with their personal gear: cloaks, tunics, boots, mess kits, whatever they were carrying. 8 men, 9 square meters, 5 feet of headroom. For comparison, the average American walk-in closet is about 6.5 feet by 6 feet. The Roman tent that housed a fighting unit was smaller than your walk-in closet. The material was leather, specifically goatskin. Panels of it, carefully selected, carefully cut, and sewn together using techniques that modern experimental archaeologists have worked hard to reconstruct. The seams were not simply stitched. They were built using a technique that prevents water from penetrating, a 2-stage welt seam, where layers are sewn in sequence so that the needle never pierces through to the outer face of the leather. It sounds like a minor technical detail, until you realize that waterproof seams meant the difference between sleeping in a relatively dry space and sleeping in a wet, freezing leather bag in the middle of a German winter. When disassembled, all the poles, stakes, and the folded leather were loaded onto the contubernium's mule. And that mule carried a lot more than just the tent. The mule's load included 2 tent poles, the folded leather tent, the tent stakes, the ropes, 2 wicker baskets used for digging the camp ditch, entrenching tools, a small stone hand mill for grinding grain, and additional food supplies. The Roman army moved with its domestic infrastructure on its back, 1 mule per 8 men. We know all this partly from excavations, particularly from the site of Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall in northern England. The Vindolanda is one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Roman world, not for its monuments, but for its preservation of organic materials that should have rotted away 2,000 years ago. The site's wet, anaerobic soil preserved actual fragments of leather tent panels, giving us physical evidence of what these shelters looked and felt like. The stitching, the thickness of the hide, the way the panels were cut and joined. We also have Trajan's column in Rome, carved in the early 2nd century AD, which depicts legionaries in their camps and gives us visual corroboration of what ancient texts describe. The hierarchy of sleeping arrangements tracked precisely with military rank, which should surprise absolutely nobody. Centurions had their own tents, larger, and with taller sidewalls to allow the headroom needed for holding small meetings and giving orders. The centurion's tent was also carried by its own dedicated mule. Senior officers, tribunes, and legates had still larger tents. And at the very top, the general's headquarters tent, the praetorium, was something else entirely, a proper mobile command center, large enough to conduct administration, hold councils of war, and project the authority of whoever commanded the army. Julius Caesar, who was famously attentive to his personal comfort in the field, reportedly brought mosaic tile flooring on campaign. The man had marble floors in his tent, while his soldiers slept on dirt 400 meters away. Some things about armies don't change. We have established the tent. Now let's talk about what was inside it. Specifically, let's talk about the absence of what we would consider normal sleeping equipment. There were no beds. This is worth emphasizing, because we have a tendency to assume a level of comfort that simply wasn't there. No cots, no sleeping pads, no mattresses, no pillows as we understand them. The Roman soldier on campaign slept on the ground. The floor of the tent was the earth itself. Dirt, maybe rocks, maybe mud if it had rained. The tent provided a roof. The floor was whatever nature had provided. There was one potential improvement available: straw. When straw could be foraged or requisitioned from local agricultural areas, it would be spread on the tent floor as a kind of crude mattress. It wasn't luxury, it was just insulation between the body and the cold ground. But here's a detail that I find telling. Straw was not free. Roman military records show that a portion of a soldier's pay was deducted to cover various operational expenses, including his food allocation, his equipment maintenance fund, and his burial society dues. Straw was on that list, too. The Roman army charged its soldiers for the privilege of not sleeping directly on bare dirt. Welcome to the ancient world. The primary layer of warmth was the cloak. The Roman military cloak came in two main forms: the sagum, a rectangular blanket-like garment, and the pennula, a heavier, more tailored wrap that some designs made hooded. Both were made from wool, and the wool was specifically chosen for its natural lanolin content, the oils inherent to sheep's wool that make the fabric water-resistant even without any additional treatment. The cloak was worn during the day march, were worn during guard duty at night, and served as both mattress and blanket when horizontal. It was the Swiss Army knife of Roman field gear, and it was issued to every soldier as a matter of operational necessity. The physical reality of Roman campaign sleep is something we need to sit with for a moment. These men marched 18 to 20 miles. They dug ditches and raised earthworks upon arrival. They performed guard rotation through the night. Then they started again at dawn. The average Roman soldier on an active campaign was operating at a level of sustained physical exertion that would be remarkable by any modern standard. And they were recovering from that exertion on the ground, under a wool blanket, in a leather tent with 7 other men. The winter scenario was different, and, if anything, worse by default, and slightly better by eventual design. The Castra Hiberna, the winter camp, was a semi-permanent installation where the army would overwinter rather than campaign through the cold months. In the Castra Hiberna, leather tents could be replaced by wooden structures, essentially barracks huts built from whatever timber was available. The tents were insulated against the cold with skins and straw packed into the walls. This was better than the summer camp situation. But better than sleeping on the ground in a leather tent in a German winter, is an extremely low bar to clear. There is a quote from the ancient sources that I find haunting in its bluntness. Vegetius, writing in the late Roman period, denotes that the old-fashioned discipline required soldiers to consider sleeping on the ground a matter of toughness and professional identity, not a hardship to be ameliorated, but a condition to be endured as proof of character. By Vegetius's time, that attitude was already fading, and he mourned it. The softening of the soldier's sleeping conditions, in his view, was a symptom of the softening of the soldier. He may have been a military conservative romanticizing a harder past. But he wasn't wrong that the men who built the empire slept on dirt, and they did it every night for years, and kept conquering anyway. I want to make one more observation about the sleeping conditions before we move on, because I think it says something important about what Rome was and how it thought about itself. The Roman military was not an egalitarian institution. It was rigidly hierarchical in almost every respect. But when it came to sleeping on campaign, the hierarchy was real, but the shared hardship was also real. Centurions had their own tents, yes. Tribunes and legates had larger quarters, yes. But everyone was in the dirt. Everyone was under canvas or leather. Everyone was cold in the German winter and hot in the Syrian summer. The Emperor Trajan, who campaigned extensively and personally, slept in the field alongside his army. Hadrian was famous for sharing the same food and conditions as his common soldiers. That symbolic equality, the general eating the same hardtack as the legionary, sleeping under the same category of shelter, was part of the compact that held the Roman army together. You suffered together. You endured together. And in the morning, you marched together again. One of the things that made the Roman army genuinely different from every other force in the ancient world was the way it organized the internal space of the camp. Not just the perimeter defenses, that was engineering. The internal layout was something closer to institutional psychology. Polybius, the Greek historian who accompanied the Roman general Scipio Africanus and witnessed Roman military operations firsthand in the 2nd century BC, was struck by the same thing that Josephus would note 2 centuries later. Roman soldiers arriving at a finished camp moved to their positions as if they had entered a well-known city and were marching to their accustomed quarters. The familiarity was the point. In alien territory, surrounded by potential hostility, the camp was the known world. Everything inside it was where it was supposed to be. That predictability was psychologically stabilizing in a way that I don't think we should underestimate. The tent layout followed the organizational structure of the army exactly. Contubernia were placed in rows along numbered streets. Each century's 10 tent groups occupied a defined rectangular plot. The centurion's tent anchored the end of his century's block. The cavalry was positioned in a specific relation to the infantry. The officers' tents, including the legates and the tribunes, clustered around the Principia, the headquarters complex at the center of the camp. The praetorium, the general's tent, was always placed with the same orientation to the camp's internal compass, where the standardization ran so deep that by the time a soldier had served through a couple of campaigns, he could navigate a Roman camp in total darkness, which was, given the 4-watch night rotation system, a genuinely practical skill. Not navigating by memory of this particular camp, but by memory of every camp, because they were all laid out the same way. The Via Principalis was always where the Via Principalis was. The headquarters tent was always in the center. The unit you belonged to was always in its assigned sector. The geography of safety was the same every night, even when every other piece of geography was foreign and hostile. I think about what that must have meant psychologically. You have marched 18 miles in the rain. You are in a province whose name you can barely pronounce. I'm among people who do not speak your language and who may be actively planning to cut your throat. You are tired in a bone-deep way that civilian life probably never prepared you for. And then the camp is finished, the gates are up, the ditch is dug, and you walk to your assigned tent plot, and everything is exactly where it was last night, and the night before that, and every night for the past 8 months of campaigning. The familiar geometry of the camp is a form of home. In a life stripped of most comforts, this was the comfort that remained. The certainty of place. There's a detail about the physical placement of tents that gives me pause every time I think about it. The rows of contubernia tents were packed in close together, so close that the tent pegs and guy ropes of adjacent tents overlapped, that if you needed to walk between 2 tent rows at night, the pegs were a genuine obstacle, a trip hazard in the dark. Multiple ancient sources note this crowding, and the implication is clear. In the interests of fitting an entire legion into a standardized camp footprint, personal space was sacrificed. You were not just sleeping near your tent mates, you were practically sleeping on top of the entire camp. Weapons and armor, by contrast, were stored outside the tent, stacked behind it, not inside. This seems counterintuitive until you think about what would happen if the camp were attacked in the middle of the night. 8 men trying to grab weapons inside a dark, 5-foot-high tent in a panic is a recipe for chaos. Weapons staged outside the tent, in a known location, in a predictable arrangement, it meant that a soldier woken by the alarm could grab his gear without fumbling and move to muster position in front of his tent row in seconds. The placement of the weapons was as deliberate as everything else. And standing between all of this organized, sleeping humanity and the outer walls were the guards, cycling through their 4-watch rotation, walking the ramparts, walking the intervallum, passing through the specific checkpoints that Polybius describes in such precise detail that you can almost hear the footsteps. The camp was not a place where people simply lay down and stopped functioning. It was a living, breathing machine that never fully turned off. Some men were always awake, some were always moving, some were always watching. And that unbroken chain of vigilance was what made it possible for the rest to sleep. But this is where the Roman management of nighttime gets genuinely fascinating. Because the Romans did not simply set a guard rotation and call it a night. They built a complete system, interlocking, redundant, verified, and accountable at every level, to ensure that the night was controlled as surely as the day. The Roman night was divided into 4 watches, vigilia in Latin. 4 equal shifts, each lasting approximately 3 hours, running from sunset to sunrise. The first watch ended around 9 in the evening. The second ended at midnight. The third ended at 3 in the morning. The fourth ended at dawn. These times weren't fixed to a clock as we understand it. The Romans used an astronomical reckoning that adjusted the watch lengths slightly with the seasons. But the principle was consistent. 4 watches, all night, on every night. To measure the duration of each watch, the Romans used a clepsydra, a water clock. Water dripping at a controlled rate through a calibrated opening, filling a vessel, marking the passage of time. It's a simple technology. But in a pre-mechanical world, in a dark camp in enemy territory, it was the technology that organized everything. At the beginning of each watch, the centurion of the first maniple of the triarii, a specific designated officer with a specific designated role, would signal the change with a bugle. 1 sound, and a quarter of the night was marked. 1 sound, and exhausted men somewhere on the perimeter peeled themselves off their posts and stumbled back toward their tents while equally exhausted replacements took their places. For the password system Polybius describes is a masterpiece of distributed verification. Each evening, a soldier designated from the 10th maniple of each unit would go to the tribune's tent at sunset, receive the night's watchword inscribed on a small wooden tablet, a tessera, and then carry it back through the camp, passing it from maniple to maniple, with witnesses present at each transfer. The tablets made their way through every unit and had to be back in the tribune's hands before full dark. If all the tablets came back, the Tribune knew that the password had reached every corner of the camp. If a tablet was missing, he knew exactly where the communication chain had broken down. It's a verification system elegant enough that you could describe it to a modern military planner, and they'd nod in recognition. The patrol rotation added another layer. 4 cavalrymen were selected each night, lots drawn to determine which watch each would cover. They received written orders. In writing, this is not a verbal system, specifying exactly which guard posts they were to inspect and exactly when. They would then proceed through the camp, showing up unannounced at each post at the designated time. Each guard would hand the patrol his own tablet as proof that he had been at his post. At the end of the night, all the tablets from all the posts would be collected and brought back to the senior cavalry commander, who would review them before reporting to the tribunes. Think about what this system actually represents. You have exhausted men, sleeping in shifts, on the ground, in the dark, in enemy territory. You need them to stay awake on guard duty. For you cannot rely on their willpower alone. Fatigue is a biological reality, not a moral failing. So you build a system where falling asleep has verifiable consequences, where an officer with written orders will appear at your post at an unpredictable time and demand your tablet, where the chain of accountability runs from the ordinary guard all the way up to the tribunes and through them to the general. The cavalry patrols weren't just checking that guards were awake. They were the nervous system of a security apparatus that made sleep itself possible for everyone who wasn't on duty. Because the system worked. Because every man in that camp knew it worked. Because they had seen what happened when it didn't. And what happened when it didn't is the subject of the next part of this story. And it is not pleasant. If you're finding this as jaw-dropping as I am, the sheer operational complexity of what these men built and maintained every single night of a campaign, hit that like button. Let's keep going. Let's talk about the punishment for falling asleep on guard duty. In most armies throughout history, sleeping on watch has been a serious offense. In some military traditions, it carries the death penalty on paper, though that penalty is rarely enforced in practice. The Romans enforced it. They enforced it in a specific, choreographed, absolutely terrifying way, and the historian Polybius describes the procedure in enough detail that you can picture every step. If a Roman soldier was caught sleeping at his post, he faced what was called the Fustuarium. Here is how it worked. For the offender was brought before a court-martial of the camp's tribunes. If found guilty, and the evidence was pretty straightforward, either you were awake or you weren't, the following would occur. The tribune would take a wooden cudgel and lightly touch the condemned man with it. That light touch was the signal. And then every single soldier in the camp was entitled, obligated, really, to beat the condemned man with clubs and stones, not symbolically, not in a measured, controlled way, until he was dead. Polybius notes that in most cases, the condemned man was killed right there, inside the camp, before anyone had to think too hard about what came next. The few who managed to survive the beating, and some did, apparently, were not thereby rescued, and they were expelled from the camp and forbidden from returning to their homes in Rome. No Roman community would take them in. Their families were forbidden from sheltering them under penalty of social ruin. The man who survived the Fustuarium was, in practical terms, already dead. He had lost everything that made Roman life worth living: his unit, his city, his family, his status, his future. The beating was actually the more merciful outcome. This same punishment applied. And this is the detail that really drives home how seriously the Romans took the night watch system, to the optio and the cavalry prefect who had failed to give proper orders at the right time to the patrols. It wasn't just the sleeping soldier who was liable. His direct supervisors were equally on the hook. The accountability cascaded upward, though if the system failed, The failure belonged to everyone who was responsible for making it work. Polybius ends his description of this system with a sentence that has stayed with me. Thus, owing to the extreme severity and inevitability of the penalty, the night watches of the Roman army are most scrupulously kept. It is such a dry, matter-of-fact summary of what is essentially a legal framework for mandatory collective murder. But he's right. The system worked precisely because the consequence was real and because everyone knew it. I want to step back from the violence for a moment and think about what this actually tells us. The Fustuarium was not sadism. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the Roman answer to a fundamental problem. How do you keep exhausted men awake and vigilant when every biological instinct in their bodies is screaming at them to close their eyes? You make the consequences of failure worse than the consequences of exhaustion. You make sleep, in that specific context, more dangerous than wakefulness. It's an extreme solution. It's a brutal solution. But it worked for centuries. And there is something else worth noting here. The punishment was communal. The whole camp participated. This wasn't a private execution carried out by specialists. It was a public, collective act. Every man who swung a club was participating in the enforcement of the rule that kept him alive while he was sleeping. The soldier doing the beating understood, on some level, and viscerally, that he was protecting the system that protected him. It was terrible. It was also coherent. We have spent a lot of time on the large-scale architecture of Roman sleep, the camps, the watches, the punishments. Now I want to zoom in, all the way in. Inside the tent, with 8 men, before the night watch takes over, most of them close their eyes. The tentorium was not just a place to sleep. It was, for the duration of a campaign, home. 8 men's home. And like any home, it contained all the mundane, unglamorous, intensely human business of daily life. Food preparation happened at the tent or just outside it. Each contubernium carried a mule load that included a small stone hand mill, a quern, for grinding grain. Wheat was a staple of the Roman military diet, and it was issued as grain rather than flour, which meant that every evening, after the camp was constructed and the tents were up, someone in the group would be grinding grain for the night's bread. Think about that. You've marched 18 miles, dug fortifications, pitched the tent, and now you're grinding grain by hand before you can eat dinner. The Roman soldier's evening was not restful. The basic military ration, the annona militaris, centered on wheat in the form of bucellatum, hard biscuit, or fresh-baked flatbread, supplemented with a salt ration, olive oil, vinegar in water, posca, the standard military drink, and occasionally lentils, cheese, cured meat, or whatever could be obtained locally through foraging or purchase. The army was supposed to be self-sufficient on campaign, but in practice, soldiers bought, traded, and sometimes simply took supplementary food from the territory they were passing through. The evidence for the intimate texture of camp life is remarkable. The Vindolanda writing tablets, thin slices of wood with ink writing on them, preserved in the waterlogged soil of a fort near Hadrian's Wall, give us actual letters written by actual Roman soldiers and their associates in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD. Among them, a soldier requesting that his correspondent send him more socks, underpants, and sandals, because what he had wasn't enough for the northern British winter. A birthday dinner invitation, notes about supplies, complaints about the local Britons. The things that survive are not the great strategic dispatches. They are the human details. Someone was cold and needed socks. Someone wanted to come to dinner. Was inside the tent, in the last hour before the first watch of the night. Men talked. They argued. They gambled. Dice were a Roman military obsession, apparently universal across all periods and all theaters of operation. They wrote letters, if they were literate, by whatever light was available. They maintained their equipment, a sword that wasn't sharpened, armor that wasn't oiled, and a sword and armor that could fail you tomorrow. They prayed, sometimes. The Roman military religion was an official, organized affair, with its own calendar of observances. But private devotion happened too, in the small hours, with a small figurine of a patron deity tucked into a corner of the kit. And then there was the smell. 8 men, wearing wool and leather, after a day of marching through summer heat or autumn mud. The leather of the tent itself, which never fully lost its organic smell. Cooking smoke. The mule was tied up outside. Vinegar from the posca. Wet boots. This was the sensory reality of conquerors, not marble halls and laurel wreaths, leather and sweat and campfire smoke, and the sound of 7 other men breathing in the dark. I find something moving about that. Not romantic. Romantic would be dishonest. But moving. The mundane reality of it. The socks and the dice and the grain mill and the smell. The empire was built by men who went home every night to 9 square meters of goatskin and a handful of straw. But let me push on one more thing, because I think it matters. We talk about the Roman army as if it were a single monolithic thing, as if legionaries were interchangeable units of military output, defined by their armor and their training and not much else. And the Vindolanda tablets shatter that illusion completely. These are not abstract soldiers. These are people with specific names, specific needs, specific relationships, specific complaints. The tablet on which a man named Flavius Carialis invites a colleague to his birthday dinner is a document of friendship. The tablet on which someone begs for more socks is a document of discomfort and trust. You only write that kind of letter to someone you expect to care. These men, inside these tents, on these nights in these camps scattered across the edges of the known world, had relationships. They knew each other's habits. They knew who snored. They knew who prayed before sleeping. They knew who was lying awake worrying about the letter he hadn't written home in 6 weeks. The tent was not just a shelter. It was, but in all the ways that matter most to human beings, a community. And communities survive what individuals cannot. That, too, was part of how Rome worked. Everything I've described so far assumes the most favorable version of Roman campaign sleep. The army is intact, the camp is constructed, and the 8 men of the contubernium are in their assigned tent. That was the standard. That was what Roman military doctrine demanded. But doctrine and reality are not always the same thing. Reconnaissance parties, advance scouts, small units sent ahead to probe enemy positions or guard a river crossing or hold a pass until the main body arrived. Cavalry detachments operate independently. Men on punishment detail, stripped of their full kit. None of these situations allowed for the full marching camp experience. And when the tent wasn't there, Roman soldiers found other ways. We have physical evidence of one such alternative from an unexpected source. In Deurne, in the modern Netherlands, archaeologists discovered an assemblage of late Roman cavalry equipment that had been carefully wrapped in a large piece of leather. That leather piece, studied by the archaeologist Carol van Driel Murray, turned out to be a tarpaulin, a single sheet made of approximately 16 goatskin panels sewn together in a 4x4 grid, measuring about 2.8 meters by 2.1 meters. It had reinforced corners and the remnants of fastening loops, suggesting that multiple such sheets could be joined together to create a larger shelter. The piece was worn, repaired, and clearly had been used extensively in the field. And this is what a Roman cavalryman carried when the full contubernium tent wasn't an option. A personal tarp, large enough to sleep under, waterproof enough to provide real protection from rain, flexible enough to be attached to his saddle and carried wherever he went. It's not romantic. It's not impressive. It's entirely practical. It is the ancient world's version of the emergency bivouac setup. There is also the Vienna Genesis, a Christian manuscript dated to the early 6th century, so late Roman period, illustrated with some of the only surviving visual depictions of late Roman military tents. The image shows a light-colored canvas stretched over a central ridgepole, held up by two shorter poles at each end in the basic shape of a traditional ridge tent. Experimental reconstructors who have built versions of this design describe it as a capable field shelter that can be pitched quickly with minimal materials. By the late Roman period, the elaborate goatskin tentorium of the early empire had apparently given way to simpler arrangements. In the most austere situations, small patrol units simply did without. The Strategicon, a late Roman military manual, recommends that light infantry operating in rough or wooded terrain should discard helmets and mail, carry minimal equipment, and travel in groups of 3 or 4. A unit moving that light is not carrying a mule's worth of tent equipment. They are sleeping under whatever sky is over them, with cloaks pulled tight, in whatever sheltered spot they can find. This was understood. This was accepted. The full marching camp was the standard. But Roman soldiers were trained and expected to function far below that standard when necessity required it. The contrast is worth holding in your mind. On one end of the spectrum, the complete castra estiva, with its ditch and rampart and standardized streets and tent rows and 4-watch guard rotation and water clock. An entire city built and defended every single night. On the other end, 4 men under a goatskin tarp, in the rain, in the forest, in enemy territory, listening to every sound. The same army, the same training, the same fundamental mission, just different nights. There was a sound that every Roman soldier on campaign knew in his bones, a sound that pulled him up out of whatever sleep he'd managed, out of the warmth of his cloak, off the ground, and back into the machinery of military life. The bucina, a bronze horn, curved in a C-shape or coiled like a serpent, blown by a specialist called the buccinator. The buccina was the Roman army's clock. It signaled the beginning of each night watch, and at dawn, it signaled the end of night, the morning call that meant the camp's rhythms were shifting from defense and rest to preparation and movement. Roman soldiers did not get to wake up slowly. The morning routine was fast, required, and supervised. After the buccina sounded, men dressed. This is not as simple as it sounds. A Roman legionary's armor, particularly the lorica segmentata of the imperial period, with its overlapping iron plates and complex lacing system, was not something you could put on alone. Soldiers helped each other dress for battle the way knights would later require squires. And the process had to be fast because the morning assembly was not optional and was not forgiving. Consider what getting dressed actually meant for a Roman legionary. It meant pulling on a woolen tunic. It meant wrapping and lacing the military boots. The calligi, heavy open sandals with iron-studded soles that were simultaneously the best and worst footwear you could imagine, excellent on cobbled roads and absolute torture on rocky mountain terrain after 3 weeks of continuous wear. It meant belting the tunic with the cingulum, the military belt that was as much a symbol of a soldier's status as any weapon. It meant donning the subermalis, a padded undergarment worn beneath the armor to prevent chafing and absorb impact. And then the armor itself, piece by piece, requiring a second pair of hands to fasten properly. But the Roman soldier did not spring from sleep to battle readiness in a matter of seconds. But the Romans had trained and drilled the process until it happened as fast as it possibly could, and every man in the century was expected to be standing in the morning assembly line at the appointed time, regardless of how little sleep he had gotten. The centurion then conducted morning inspection. Each man was checked, his weapons sharp, his armor intact, his kit in order. The vine staff came out for any failures, and no one was waiting around. Orders for the day were distributed. Guard assignments were confirmed. The daily watchword for the coming night was already being circulated through the command structure. The machine was turning before most of the men had fully woken up. And then the camp was destroyed, and this is the part that always stops me. The Romans had spent 3 to 6 hours the previous evening constructing a fortified installation. Now they were taking it apart. Every tent was struck, folded, and loaded onto its mule. The gate timbers were pulled down, the watchtowers were dismantled. And then, and this is the part that genuinely impresses me, the entire camp was burned or demolished, not left standing for the next passerby to use, not abandoned and forgotten, destroyed, systematically. The palisade stakes would either be loaded back onto the soldiers' packs for use the following night or burned in place. The larger structural elements, the gateposts, the watchtower frameworks, went into the fire. Ancient sources are clear on this. The Romans did not leave infrastructure behind for potential enemies, where the camp existed for the army that built it, and when that army left, the camp ceased to exist. Polybius records that the practice was so regular, so embedded in Roman military culture, that the number of days traveled on campaign was expressed in terms of camps. Pervenere ad locum, tertius castris. To arrive at a place in 3 camps, meaning 3 days of marching, 3 nightly camps, 3 mornings of construction and destruction. The camp was the unit of time. The camp was the measure of the march. There is something philosophically interesting about the destruction of the camp every morning. Every other civilization that had large military forces left traces on the landscape. Ruins, earthworks, abandoned fortifications that could be reused by the next army to come through. The Romans deliberately refused to do this, and they erased themselves from the ground. The camp belonged to no place. It belonged only to the moment, to the army, to the night that just passed. When the column marched away and the smoke rose from the burning timbers, it was as if the camp had never existed. Except, of course, in the bodies of the men who had built it and would build it again tonight, in a different field, on a different piece of ground, with the same stakes and the same ditch dimensions, and the same tent rows in the same positions. The camp was portable. It lived in the soldiers, in their trained hands and their disciplined routine. You could not destroy a Roman marching camp by burning it. It would reappear the next evening, 20 miles down the road. Now, with the camp gone and the formation assembled on the road, the day began again. Another 18 miles ahead. Another campsite at the end. Another 3 to 6 hours of digging, raising, and building before anyone got to sleep again. The buccina would sound at the appointed hours. The tablets would circulate. The cavalry would draw lots. And 8 men would lie down in 9 square meters of goatskin and listen to each other breathe. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment to do it. Every week on this channel, we take history this seriously. The real mechanics of how ancient life actually worked, not the highlights reel. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one. But first, let's talk about why this whole system mattered so much. I want to pull back now and look at the big picture. Because the marching camp, and the entire system of organized nighttime that surrounded it, was not just an operational practice. It was a strategic advantage of enormous consequence, and the Romans knew it. Polybius, in one of the most perceptive military observations in ancient literature, directly contrasted the Roman approach to camping with the Greek approach. The Greeks, he noted, trusted to a judicious selection of ground. They picked sites with natural defensive advantages and adapted to the terrain. They were good at it. But they did not build. They relied on nature to protect them. The Romans, Polybius observed, trusted their own engineering above the gifts of geography. They didn't need a defensible hill. They didn't need a river on their flank. They brought their defenses with them, and they erected them wherever they happened to be stopping for the night. The practical consequences were enormous. A Roman army could operate for months in featureless, to hostile territory, no natural strong points, no friendly cities, no supply depots, and always have a secure base to return to at the end of each day. The Celts of Gaul, the Germanic tribes across the Rhine, the Dacians of modern Romania, the Britons of the far north. None of these peoples had anything comparable. Their armies required dispersion after a few days in the field because they had no mechanism for maintaining a concentrated force without draining local resources. The Romans, with their disciplined camp system and their standardized logistics, could stay. And staying, in ancient warfare, was most of winning. Vegetius, writing in the late 4th or early 5th century AD, understood this at a level that reads like genuine grief. By his time, the Roman army had largely abandoned the traditional marching camp system, and the discipline required to build and maintain it every night had eroded across generations of a changing, increasingly federalized military. And Vegetius mourns this explicitly. He writes that the art of camp construction is now entirely lost, for it is long since any of our camps have been fortified, either with trenches or palisades. By this neglect, our forces have been often surprised by day and night by the enemy's cavalry and suffered very severe losses. He is describing, in the language of a military manual, the slow collapse of a civilization. When Rome stopped building its camps every night, it stopped being able to protect its soldiers at night. When it stopped protecting its soldiers at night, it lost the ability to project force over long distances for long periods. When it lost that ability, the frontier began to fold. For the camp was not just a place to sleep. It was an expression of Roman confidence, Roman discipline, and Roman willingness to do hard, unglamorous, exhausting work in the service of an institutional goal. And the soldiers who built it understood this, even if they never articulated it in those terms. They built the camp every night because they had been trained to build the camp every night. They maintained the watches because the consequences of not maintaining them were lethal. And in the aggregate, across centuries and continents and thousands of nights, that discipline compounded into an empire. There is a phrase in Latin that captures something of this: sub pellibus, under the skins. That's what Roman soldiers on a summer campaign were called: men under the skin, under the goatskin tents in the standardized camps, in the managed dark, with the watchword passing from hand to hand and the water clock measuring out the night. It's a humble phrase for something that was, in its quiet way, extraordinary. Think about the psychological dimension of this for a moment. You are a Roman legionary. You are far from home, maybe very far from home. You are in a landscape that is strange to you, among people who may actively want you dead. You are tired in a way that civilian life in Rome never prepared you for. And yet, every evening, your camp exists. Every evening there are walls between you and whatever is out there. Every evening your tent mates are in their places, the guards are on the ramparts, the password is circulating, and the buccina will sound when it is time to change. The world outside the camp is uncertain. But the world inside it is the most ordered, most controlled, most predictable environment the Roman state knew how to create. That is nothing. That is, in fact, everything. No system lasts forever. And the Roman marching camp system, one of the most effective institutional practices in military history, did not die in a single moment of catastrophic failure. It died the way most great institutions die. Slowly, incrementally, through the accumulation of small compromises made under pressure, until one day someone looked up, and the thing that had been there was gone. The 3rd century AD was the breaking point for many Roman institutions. The crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 235 to 284 AD, saw the empire racked by near-continuous civil war, economic collapse, plague, and external pressure on every frontier simultaneously. On dozens of emperors rose and fell within decades. Legions that should have been guarding the Rhine or the Danube were instead marching on Rome to install their own general. The army that emerged from this crisis was not the army that Polybius had described. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries reorganized the military in ways that changed its fundamental character. The old legionary system was supplemented by increasingly large numbers of foederati, barbarian troops fighting under their own leaders, under their own tribal customs, for pay and plunder, rather than for Roman citizenship and Roman discipline. These were effective fighters in many contexts. They were not, by training or tradition, builders of marching camps. And the discipline required to construct a full castra estiva every single night was not natural. It had to be instilled, maintained, and enforced through a system that required capable centurions, trained soldiers, and the institutional will to punish failure severely. As that system eroded, fewer Roman-born soldiers, fewer veteran centurions, less consistent training, the nightly camp became less rigorous, then sporadic, then largely abandoned. Vegetius is the most explicit witness to this collapse. Writing sometime in the 380s to 440s AD, he describes a military that has forgotten things it once knew and suffers for the forgetting. He is not describing a dramatic, sudden loss. He is describing the result of a long process of degradation that by his time had already played out. The camps are not built. The palisades are not erected. And so the cavalry attacks come in the night, and men who should have been sleeping safely behind Roman-built walls are dying on open ground instead. There is something deeply sad about Vegetius. He is a man who understands what was lost but cannot get it back. He writes his military manual not because the army can still implement it, but because he wants the knowledge to survive, wants someone in the future to read it and understand what the old army was. He is writing a monument to a practice that is already dead. The last Roman marching camp, built according to the old standards, with its ditch and rampart and standardized streets and 4-watch guard rotation, was probably constructed sometime in the 3rd century, though we cannot date such a specific end with certainty. After that, Roman soldiers slept differently, less organized, or less protected. Less Roman, in the specific sense that the word Roman had carried for 5 centuries of imperial expansion. When the form of the camp went, something of the substance of Rome went with it. The tent stakes and the ditches and the water clocks and the watchword tablets were not just operational details. They were the physical instantiation of what Rome was: organized, rigorous, disciplined, willing to do the unglamorous work that kept the whole thing running. When the soldiers stopped doing the work, the whole thing stopped running. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inexorably. It took until 476 AD for the Western Empire to formally end. But in a real sense, Rome began to end on all those nights when someone decided the ditch could wait until morning. The empire was not taken from Rome. Rome put it down, on one unlabored evening at a time, until the habit of invincibility was gone, and nothing was left but the memory of what had once been built between sunset and dark. Let me bring you back to where we started. The Teutoburg Forest, 9 AD. 8 men in a goatskin tent the size of a walk-in closet. The dark presses in from every direction. The guards on the rampart are cycling through their watches. The water clock measures out the night. The tablets with the watchword passed hand to hand until they came back to the tribune before dark. This is how the men who built the Western world went to sleep. Not in comfort, not in safety as we understand it, but in a structured, organized, deliberately engineered relationship with the night that gave them something more valuable than a soft bed. It gave them the ability to function the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, for months and years in hostile territory far from home. The Roman Empire did not happen because of any single battle, any single general, any single innovation in weapons or tactics. It happened because of the accumulation of discipline, daily, nightly, across decades and centuries, that allowed Roman armies to maintain their cohesion and their effectiveness when every other army in the ancient world would have fragmented and gone home. The marching camp is a large part of that story. The 4 watches of the night are a large part of that story. The 8 men in the goatskin tent, grinding grain and sharpening swords and passing the watchword and lying down on straw and wool, are a large part of that story. Think about the sheer scale of what we've covered in this video. But from the moment the marching column halted, the Roman machine kicked into a gear that had no off switch. Surveyors out front, measuring and flagging before the soldiers arrived. Engineers are directing the digging of ditches 3 meters deep. Thousands of palisade stakes, carried on the backs of the soldiers themselves, were being planted one by one into the rampart. Tents rising in rows, precise and orderly, each in its assigned place. The mule of each contubernium being unloaded, the leather tent unfolded, the poles driven in, the pegs hammered down. Grain is being ground, water is being fetched. The watchword begins its journey through the maniples, and by the time the last light faded, a city had appeared in a field or a forest or a desert where nothing had been that morning. Then sleep, broken sleep. And the sleep of men who know that 3 hours from now someone will relieve them on the wall, and 3 hours after that someone else, and 3 hours after that the buccina will call them to rise and do it again. It was not restful by any standard we would recognize, but it was organized, it was maintained, and it worked. I want to leave you with one more thought. Vegetius, writing in what was already the twilight of the Western Empire, describes the marching camp as something the Roman army had forgotten how to build. He writes it the way a man describes a skill that has been lost from his family, with grief, with the specific ache of knowing that something real and important is gone and cannot easily be recovered. He says the army suffers from this loss. He says men die at night because the camps are not built and the walls are not there. And he is right. The Roman Empire ended for many reasons. Scholars have been arguing about those reasons for 1,500 years, and will probably argue for 1,500 more. But I think Vegetius has put his finger on something real. When Rome stopped doing the unglamorous, exhausting, absolutely necessary work of building the camp every night, something essential had already been given up. The camp was a choice, made fresh every evening to impose order on chaos, to refuse the temptation of simply lying down in the open and trusting to luck. When that choice stopped being made, the empire was already failing. The armies and the barbarians just hadn't caught up to the fact yet. The next time you find yourself complaining about your mattress, or your temperature, or the noise from the neighbors, take a moment to think about the men who built the aqueducts and the roads and the legal frameworks that are still with us today. They slept on the ground. They paid for their own straw. They faced death, a genuine, communal, choreographed death, for the offense of closing their eyes at the wrong moment. And they got up at dawn and marched 18 miles and did it all again. That is a kind of toughness that I find genuinely humbling. Not admirable in a way I want to replicate. I am very happy to sleep in a bed. But humbling. The distance between their world and ours is enormous. The fact that their world built ours is worth remembering. If this video gave you something, a new way of thinking about Rome, a detail you'd never heard before, A genuine sense of what those men's lives were like on the ground. Then do me a favor. Drop a comment below and tell me what hit hardest. Was it the Fustuarium? The 9 square meters for 8 men? The fact that they charged soldiers for straw? The tessera passing hand to hand through the dark? I genuinely want to know what landed for you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit that button. Every week we go this deep into the history that shaped the world we live in. No fluff, no oversimplification, just the real story told the way it deserves to be told. I would love to have you here for the next one. Until then, I'll see you in the next video.